everyone, and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's dive in to study some Jewish history together. Tonight we're going to begin the story of modern Zionism, political Zionism, the modern state of Israel, which will take us a number of sessions split by many watershed major world events. But we're going to start really delving into the topic tonight, and over the next few weeks we'll hopefully get some clarity in the topic. So when we look at the return of the Jews to Israel, we call it a return, but there was never a moment where there were no Jews in Israel. Even when the Ramban, after having to flee Spain, goes back in the 13th century, he's able to put together a minyan of Jews. He has to pay them to move to Jerusalem to be part of his minyan, but there are at least some Jews there. So after the end of the Jewish presence at the time of the Romans, the population goes way down. It was almost completely eradicated by the Crusaders. But once Saladin takes over in the Battle of Chittim, which actually happened yesterday on the Jewish calendar in the 12th century, then there's, whatever small amounts of Jews that are still there are able to sort of come out of hiding. And really from that point on, there's a start of a very slow trickle of Jews coming back to Israel. Again, there's never a time when there was no one there, but the few that were there and survived the Crusades are able to sort of come out of the closet, and then there's a very slow trickle of Jews starting to make their way back. That trickle turns into a little bit of a flow after the Spanish expulsion, when the Jews of Spain, realized they basically had nowhere to go. They were kicked out of Spain, kicked out of Portugal, kicked out of place after place after place. Western Europe had become bankrupt. Many Jews moved to Eastern Europe. But we're going to see throughout this time period of Jews constantly being kicked out of countries that every time they're kicked out of somewhere, there's always an idea of returning to Israel. And with each of those ideas, it's going to start as a flicker. The flicker will become a flame, and the flame will become a fire. So the very first flicker of that starts after the Spanish expulsion in the late 15th century, going into the 16th century, and we see that a lot of the Sephardic exiles of Spain go to Israel, and they form communities in both Jerusalem and in Tzfat. And we had talked about that several sessions ago when we talked about the rise of Tzfat as a center of Kabbalah and the great scholars that were there, like Rav Yosef Cairo, Moshe Cordovero, the Arizal, etc. And that was, like I said, the trickle starts to turn into a little bit of a flow at that point, and there's a steady, slow but steady growth of these Jewish communities. But until the 1700s, it's just Sephardim. So through the 1500s, 1600s, the exiles of Spain come to Israel and start to repopulate the land. Now, in the 1700s, there was a group of Ashkenazi Jews who were inspired by the great Rabbi Yehuda Chassid to return to Israel. The idea was that he felt it was time for the Jews to go back and to essentially take over the land of Israel, because let's face it, at that point, the country was controlled by the Ottomans. The Ottomans were already very much the sick man of Europe at that point, and there was not much going on there. I mean, we have many writings, like from Mark Twain later, of what Israel looked like at this time, and it was a really desolate, decrepit, very difficult place to live. The place was swamp-ridden. We all grew up putting money in the pushka to plant trees in Israel to drain the swamps, the Chulda swamp, etc. And it was really very difficult to live there. So we see that it was. By the way, the Ottomans had basically deforested the whole land. There were no trees there, and that's why this concept of planting trees became such a big thing. But the idea was, okay, the Ottomans, there's a backwater part of their empire. In Rabbi Yehuda Chassid said, well, let's go and settle in the land of Israel. So estimates are that about 1,500 Ashkenazi Jews set out from Europe, from Poland, to make their way to Israel. And again, this is long before El Al, modern transportation, anything. And the journey itself was a very tumultuous one, a very dangerous one. And the estimates are that over half of those 1,500 people actually pass away in the journey to Israel. And tragically, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid himself makes it to Israel, but but passes away a day after arriving. So a large number down the way from illness, from the long journey, and but there's now at this point the numbers, by the way, before these. By the way, I think I said a half more, maybe a third passed away, so maybe 1,000 make it. So the numbers at this point, there's probably, at least in Jerusalem, there's a community of about 1,000 Jews, 1,000 Sephardi Jews, and maybe 200 Ashkenazi Jews, but it's a Sephardi community. So the Olim of Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, let's say there are maybe 1,000 once they got there, they come to Jerusalem and they build the beginning of an Ashkenazi community in Jerusalem. And now this community is referred to as the Old Yishuv. You'll hear that title quite often, and that's a title to reference the community that was in Israel essentially from this time, from the 1700s until really the late early 1900s with the first Aliyah. So this is called the Old Yishuv, because this is when, again, the flow gets a little bit stronger. So an interesting thing happens with this Ashkenazi community. When they get to Jerusalem, they're destitute, sick, it's not a very pretty picture, but they borrow money from the local Arab community to be able to construct a synagogue for themselves. Now, as they were in the process of constructing the synagogue, they ran out of funds, they had to borrow more money, and the interest rates were very high in those days. Nowadays we talk about the interest rates going up because, now you can no longer get a mortgage for 3%, they're up to 4%. Interest rates at this time, we're talking 20, 30, 40%, backbreaking interest. But nevertheless, they build a synagogue, the first major synagogue in the old city of Jerusalem, known as, it's now today known as the Corva Synagogue. Now we'll see in a moment why it's called the Corva Synagogue. The Corva Synagogue is in the old city of Jerusalem, that beautiful dome synagogue right in the Rova. That's the synagogue that they built. Now, what happened was that by 1720, the Ashkenazi community that built the Corva Synagogue was unable to pay the debts to the Arab community. So what happened was the Arab creditors or debt collectors broke into the synagogue one day, and they set the synagogue ablaze, and it burnt down to the ground. They destroyed the homes of the Ashkenazi community in the old city of Jerusalem, and all of the Ashkenazi Jews fled the city of Jerusalem and went to other places where there were other fledgling communities, like in Svat, Tveria, and in Hebron. Now, from that point on, the synagogue becomes known as the Corva Synagogue, the destroyed synagogue. So yes, it will actually be destroyed twice, because the synagogue will be destroyed in the War of Independence, in the 48 War. It'll be bombed by the Jordanians. And after the 67 War, there will be an arch put in place of the synagogue to commemorate that it was there, and the process will begin to rebuild the synagogue. And, wonderful Israeli bureaucracy, it won't be rebuilt until the 2000s. But when you go to Jerusalem today and you go in the beautiful Corva Synagogue, again, the Corva means the destroyed synagogue, has not been destroyed twice. It is assumed to be an almost exact replica of the original one from Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. So anyhow, in 1720, that's the macro picture of the synagogue. But in 1720, the Arabs basically kicked the Ashkenazi Jews out of the community, burned the synagogue to the ground, and from that point on, the Ashkenazi Jews that remained in Jerusalem would actually dress in Sephardi garb to protect themselves. Now, at this point, the Ashkenazi and Sephardi communities dress very different. The Ashkenazi communities dress kind of similar to how the Yerushalmis dress today, with the purple robes during the week, the white robes on Shabbos. That's how Ashkenazim dress, whereas the Sephardic community dressed in the Arabic robes that Sephardim always dressed in those times. But that's how at least the Ashkenazi Jews that remained protected themselves. Now, in 1750, the Hasidic, a trickle of Hasidim start to come from Europe. Now, this is really the beginning of sort of the second wave of Ashkenazi immigration, but the numbers go up significantly at this point. Now, what happens is this is all done through messianic fervor. Hasidus has always had an undertone, or an overtone, I should say, of messianic fervor, and the idea was that we're going to go back to Israel to prepare for the coming of the Mashiach, of the Messiah, and we're going to force his coming by going back to Israel. So this was really inspired by the Baal Shem Tov, who himself tried to get to Israel, but could never make it there himself. Yet he sent many of his students. His brother-in-law, Rav Gershon Kittiver, was one of the people who went, and that's the beginning of the Hasidic community in Israel. They go again to the four holy cities, Tzfat, Tveria, Hebron, and we're going to see eventually to Jerusalem. But this is the beginning of the Hasidic community. So we have the Sephardic community start to come after the exile of Spain. We have the general Ashkenazi community come really before the Hasidic movement was established, with the followers of Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. And then in the mid-18th century, we have the disciples, the Baal Shem Tov, who come to Jerusalem. Now, it was a very interesting situation for these Ashkenazi Jews at this point in Israel, because, as we said, the Turks were already, probably always were, but for sure at that point were already known for their their corruption, and Israel was just a backwater part of their empire. So many of the European powers saw the land of Israel, and many of the European powers at this point are still influenced by religion, and they wanted to, so to speak, get a foothold in the land of Israel, so that when the Turks would eventually fall, now no one knew it was going to still take almost 200 years, but the idea is when the Turks would eventually fall, that they would be there ready to pick up what they called Palestine, what we call Israel, as part of their empire. Now, we all know, and we'll talk about, the British won that battle, so to speak. But they all try to get a foothold in Israel because of the religious, the religious place it plays even for the Christians. So each of the major European powers, France, England, Russia, Germany, Prussia, they all build consulates in Israel, and they protected their citizens. So it comes out to be a pretty interesting situation, because the Russian Jew had zero rights in Russia, but once he went to Israel, he was protected by the Russian consulate in Israel. It was just an interesting situation that came out. Now, that was only for the Ashkenazim, who came from Russia and France and all these other places. Well, really just from Russia at this point, Russia and the Polish Empire, and at this point, as we discussed in the past few weeks, the borders between the two are waxing and waning. But this was a protection only afforded to the Ashkenazim, but the Sephardim are not protected at all. So what happens at this point is we see the Ashkenazim have a certain amount of protection because the Ottomans don't want to mess with the Russians, but the Sephardim are really treated pretty poorly by the Ottomans, and even we're going to see eventually by the Ashkenazi Jews. Not really at this point, but it will grow, and we're going to see as the movement of Jews coming back to Israel, really from this point until after the founding of the state, is going to be all Ashkenazim, and unfortunately, the Sephardim will be treated as second-class citizens. To quote a friend of mine's father, for those of you from Cleveland, you know Dr. Rafi Israeli, so he often quotes his father, who's a nice Reuben Israeli, a nice Sephardic Jew from Israel, who says that when he was growing up in Israel, he was black. He was a minority, and when he moved to America, he became white because in America he looks white compared to the African Americans. But in Israel, he was Sephardic, so he was treated as a second-class citizen. And that was the situation that really starts at this point, and this is really the beginning of it. The fact that the Ashkenazim had protection from Russia, but the Sephardim did not. So the Sephardim become like second-class citizens from this point on, and their community really doesn't grow much until we're going to see until the 1950s. It's really all Ashkenazim all the time at this point, building the country. Now, what's interesting and is that in Jerusalem, we're going to see at this time, as the Jews return to Jerusalem, that already, now there's different censuses from this time, all with a lot of discrepancy, but from anywhere from as early as the early 1800s to the latest possibility would be the late 1800s, there's already a majority Jewish population in the city of Jerusalem, and probably in the country soon after. And I will, again, get a little ahead of ourselves. We'll talk about that more when we come to the first Aliyah, but anyone who talks about Jerusalem not being the capital of the Jewish people, since the 1800s, there's been a majority Jewish population there, and before that, there wasn't much going on there at all. So anyhow, so we go on until the later part of the 18th century to in around 1780, when the Vilna Gaon, inspired by similar attitudes of the Hasidic community, sends his disciples to the land of Israel. Now, he also tried to get to the land of Israel. He tried several times, but saw it as a decree from heaven that it wasn't meant to be, that because he never made it. But he sends his disciples to Israel, and many of them go to Jerusalem. And at this point, again, they're protected by Russia. So the previous mistreatment in the 1720s by the students of Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, well, the Ottomans and the Arabs can't do that anymore. So the students of the Vilna Gaon come back to Jerusalem, protected by the Russians, and they rebuild the Corva Synagogue. So this is now, it was built originally in the early 1700s, destroyed 1720, rebuilt somewhere around 1780, and it'll survive as the major Jewish synagogue in the Old City of Jerusalem until 1948, when it'll be blown up by the Arabs, and I already described the rest previously. So that's what happens with the synagogue. Now, it's interesting today that when you go in the Corva Synagogue, it's considered it's protected by the Ministry of Antiquities. It's considered one of the historical sites in Israel. But the congregation there is a group of the students of Rabbi Zilberman, who probably more than anyone alive, any group today, attempt to follow the customs of the Vilna Gaon to a T. So it's very interesting that the shul here was rebuilt by the students of the Vilna Gaon in 1780, and then when it was eventually rebuilt again in the 2000s and opened up again, I think 2008, if I remember correctly, it's still the customs very much so of the Vilna Gaon. So I had the privilege of davening there one Shabbos a couple years ago, about 5 years ago, and it's not that different than your regular Ashkenazi davening, but there are definitely differences. So if you want to go see a real vintage Vilna Gaon style prayer service, go to the Corva Synagogue in Jerusalem. So this is the beginning, really, of the Jews coming back to Israel. Now, at this time, it is a very difficult situation. There's malaria, there's cholera, there's earthquakes that happen at this time, and it's we think now about making Aliyah. It's such a hard decision because as my father always says, you know how you make a small fortune in Israel? Well, you start off with a large fortune, it becomes a small fortune. And yeah, I don't want to minimize it. It is difficult, but let's face it, you don't have to give up a lot, at least in creature comforts, to make Aliyah, to move to Israel nowadays. But at this time, it was they were giving up a lot. Now, I say giving up a lot, but mind you, most of these are people, or virtually all these people are coming from Russia, Poland, the Pale Settlement, where conditions were pretty terrible. So a lot of this movement to come to Israel is really in response to the same sentiments that we talked about last week. As the anti-Semitism is growing in Russia, the Jews just have to get out. And that's, like we said, in the 1800s will inspire many, 2 million or 3 million, like we discussed last week, to go to America. But that's also inspiring this small trickle to go to Israel. And then eventually, at the same time, when 3 million go to America, we're going to see the first Aliyah comes to Israel, which we'll discuss in the coming weeks. There's also the beginning of the building outside of Jerusalem. We mentioned before Moshe Montefiore, and he supports the building of Yamin Moshe, which is the first neighborhood outside Jerusalem. But the neighborhoods start to grow. First Yamin Moshe, then Mea Sharim, and the beginning of the new city of Jerusalem, so to speak. And like we said, definitely by the end of the 18th century, it's a majority Jewish population in Jerusalem, and probably in the country at that point. Okay, now the country. While we said they had there's a certain amount of political support of the old Yishuv from the Russians, there was not financial support, and it was not so easy for the Jews to make it in Israel, because even though they try to get involved in agriculture from the very beginning, the land does not lend itself to agriculture very easily. Now we go and we see all the amazing advancements in technology in Israel and the amazing agriculture that's there now, but that was definitely not always the case. So for the most part, the community is supported by charity from European Jews, and there's a concept that is established at this time called the Charity of Rabbi Meir Baal HaNes. Not 100% clear why the charity became named after Rabbi Meir Baal HaNes. Rabbi Meir Baal HaNes is the famous Tana in the Gemara who performs basically a miracle he goes to free his daughter his sister-in-law who's captured by the Romans, and he tells the guard to let her go, and tells him that if the Romans come after him, just say Elokai Rabbi Meir Aneni, that the God of Rabbi Meir should answer me, and the Roman guard part is answered, and he ends up converting to Judaism. And there's a concept of that's actually mentioned by the Chida that whenever we have a distressful situation, we should give tzedakah, we should give charity with the, so to speak, in the memory of Remer Bal Hanes. And just like he was able to, his prayers were answered in miraculous ways, the difficult situation that we are in will be relieved in miraculous ways. So I think that's probably where the concept came from, that the support of the old Yishuv in Israel was called the charity of Remer Bal Hanes, because basically at that point it was miraculous. Like, it was going to take miracles to make it happen. And I think that's why, that's where the name comes from. But the money, it comes from the support of European Jewry, which wasn't so wealthy at that point. Now, what's interesting is that, again, just the political dichotomy at this time, that in Russia, the Ottomans were an enemy. And therefore, if you were sending money from Russia to Israel, well, that was part of the Ottoman Empire, so you were sending money to an enemy. So it was considered a treasonous act. So all this money had to be delivered in a very covert way. And we're going to see in many ways this will come back to bite the Jews in the fight between the Misnagdim, between the non-Hasidim and the Hasidim. This will be used a lot of times when they go to the government to get involved. They'll say, hey, they send money to the Ottoman Empire. They send money to the Ottoman Empire. Now, both of them were doing it. And the Russians, who just loved the Jews, took no opportunity to persecute them for this. So when we talk about, by the Lubavitcher Chassidim, they have certain holidays where their leaders were arrested. Well, a lot of times this was the crime. It was it was sending money to the land of Israel. Now, as the community starts to build in Israel and the support from Europe starts to coalesce in a certain way, there's a grassroots movement that becomes known as the Chovevei Tzion, the lovers of Zion. Now, these are the people back in Europe who are promoting the ideas of returning to Israel and supporting the community in Israel. Now, the Chovevei Tzion were really a strange mix of people, but it was really the antecedents and the first sprouting of the Zionist movement. Now, even though many of the Chovevei Tzion weren't necessarily religious groups, a lot of it was coming out of the Haskalah, the Enlightenment, but the ideas were basically religious. The ideas were that the time of the Jews in Europe was done, so it was time to go back to Israel, and let's push the hand of the Messianic era. And therefore, that's what they did. So they would help Jews get to Israel. They would raise money for Jews in Israel. They would do things to try and encourage the Jews in Israel to become self-sufficient through agriculture. And really, that's where they were coming from. And their basis was quite simple, that Israel belongs to the Jews, and we have a right to go back. And if we do it, Hashem will help to make it happen. And that was really this concept of this grassroots movement that at this point is known as the Chovevei Tzion. Now, the spiritual leader of this movement was a Prussian rabbi by the name of Reb Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer. And he wrote a lot about the idea of returning to Zion and really was the first, we would say, sort of religious Zionist leader at this time. And this is what was happening back in Europe. Now, what's interesting is that he himself was from Prussia, that's Western Europe, and he would the undertone, or really the overtone of this movement, was that there was no future for Jews in Eastern Europe. Now, they didn't say the same at that point for Western Europe. Right? They didn't say the same at that point. But they definitely tell Eastern Europe, no future, so let's get the Jews out of Eastern Europe. Now, there are other great rabbis who joined onto this movement. The great Netziv, the Rosh Hashiva of Volozhin, Shmuel Molver was another great rabbi. And initially, the Reform movement, the Enlightenment, is bitterly opposed. Now, what's interesting is the Reform movement, even though it already exists in Germany at this time in the 1800s, will be vehemently anti-Zionist until long after the State of Israel is established. So, I always say that nowadays when we look at the Reform movement trying to gain a foothold in the land of Israel and having a very difficult time, and we'll maybe talk about that in some future lectures, but to a certain extent, they're also getting their just desserts, because for 100 years, many of them, not all of them, because we're going to see there were exceptions, Abba Hillel Silver and others, but as a movement, they definitely in Germany and even in the early of the Reform movement in America, they really fought vehemently against the ideas of Zionism. They removed any mention of Zion from their prayer books, any mention of the Jews returning to Zionism, and that's what went on over there. Now, the entirety at this point through the 1800s of the old Yishuv, of the Jewish community in Israel, was supported by Baron Edmund de Rothschild, the great financier who known for making his fortune in the banking industry, and he really financed the entirety of the old Yishuv, the first Aliyah. For a while, the early settlements in Israel are financed by the Rothschilds, and really the fingerprints of that in many ways are still present until this very day. In fact, when I was a student learning in yeshiva in Israel 25 years ago, whatever it was, at that point, Carmel, I don't know if they still do, but the Carmel Winery had a special edition called the Baron Select or whatever it was, and it had a picture of Baron de Rothschild on it. And part of the reason for that is he founded the Carmel Winery. That was one of the ways they were trying to build the agriculture in Israel. But there's more than that. There's a statement that people still say in Israel. You'll hear sometimes when there's a discussion of how to pay for something. Like, let's say you're at a meal and you don't know who's going to pick up the check. Someone will or the waiter will say, here's the check. You'll say, the response will be in Hebrew, al cheshbon de baron, put it on the account of the baron, because that was really the attitude of the early settlers of Israel, that Baron de Rothschild was paying for everything. So even now in 2022, 200 years later, there's still this common phrase that I think maybe a lot of Israeli kids don't even know where it comes from. But when you're discussing how you're going to pay for something, al cheshbon de baron. Okay, so that's a lot of what's going on in Europe. The early trickle of the Jews coming back to Israel. But I think if we want to look at a watershed moment that sparks modern Zionism, it's the Dreyfus Affair in France. Now, the Dreyfus Affair was, you want to talk about government conspiracy at the max, that's the Dreyfus Affair. Like Watergate or anything after doesn't hold a candle to the Dreyfus Affair. So what was the Dreyfus Affair? Now, at this time, it's the French Third Republic, and the whole incident, which becomes known as l'affaire in French. I don't speak French, so I probably pronounced that totally wrong, but l'affaire is what they would call it, and it lasts essentially from 1804 to 1906. And the culture in France is very interesting at this point, because Jews were emancipated from France already in 1791, I believe, and we talked about Napoleon and the Sanhedrin and the attempts to assimilate the Jews, and so to a certain extent, there was at least there was no religious anti-Semitism in France anymore. But what we're going to see is, as the religious anti-Semitism of the church is not embraced in Western Europe at this point, it's just going to be replaced by nationalistic anti-Semitism. So whereas from the beginning of really Constantine and the Christians getting the upper hand in the world up until modernity, all anti-Semitism in the world is going to be based on religion, right? We killed Jesus, we didn't accept Jesus, something like that. And even when the Muslims take over, that's going to be obviously based on religion as well. But now that religion wasn't a factor in the new liberal world, the religious anti-Semitism will go out the door, but a much more virulent nationalistic anti-Semitism will replace it. And that's going to be the anti-Semitism of the 19th and 20th century, and we all know what that will lead to. So that's present in France at this time as well. And so this is the France that we're coming into when we discuss the Dreyfus Affair. Okay, so now at this point, the Jews had emerged, they had come out of the ghetto, they had reached a certain amount of success, like the Rothschilds throughout France, and as Jews often are wont to do, they didn't do a lot of favors for themselves, because they and even the Rothschilds, all the good that came from the Rothschilds, there's also, we're going to see that as with a lot of their cunning and finance, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be hurt on the opposite end of that, and that will just turn into a latent anti-Semitism. So this is sort of the anti-Semitism that's simmering under the surface at the time of the Dreyfus Affair, and really we have to understand as a backdrop as a backdrop, is that in 1870, France, that claimed to have the best army in the world, will lose a war to Germany in the Franco-Prussian War, and this will be an overwhelming defeat for the French. They'll have two of their armies will completely surrender. Napoleon III will be dethroned, which will pave way for the Third French Republic that we're now discussing, and Germany will annex Alsace-Lorraine and will annex the area of Alsace-Lorraine. And this was a huge debacle for the French, and it sets into motion a tremendous rearmament, nationalistic movement that essentially France will start to prepare for their next showdown with Germany. Now, we all know that will be World War I, but really from the loss in 1870 until World War I, that movement will be underway. Now, while this is going on, there's a lot of espionage is also happening. So something that I don't know might happen until this very day, but at that point, after Germany and France reestablished diplomatic relations, the French employ certain spies to work at the German embassy, and one of them is a housekeeper of the German embassy. And one day she finds a letter that becomes known as the bordereau, and it's a note really, and the note is found in the embassy, and it explains certain French armament, certain new French guns that were being developed that the French army was going to have. Now, this letter is taken by this French maid, who's really a spy, and given over to the French general staff. And at that point, the French general staff knows that they have a spy. They have someone who's leaking secrets of their rearmament to the German embassy, and therefore ultimately back to the Germans. So they look at this and they see the note is it's talking about artillery, so it had to be an artillery officer. So they want to try and figure out who it is. There's certain members of the general staff claim to be handwriting experts. Well, they weren't, but they claimed to be. And they look at the French general staff and they find, well, there is one Jew on the French general staff, and he happens to be an artillery officer, and his name is Captain Alfred Dreyfus. So at that point, they know they have a spy, they have proof that they have a spy, and they have their scapegoat, the one Jew who could maybe possibly be that spy. Now, the problem was the handwriting really didn't match, and even the attempt of these people who claimed to be handwriting experts to prove that it was Dreyfus's handwriting was really ridiculous, because if you look at Dreyfus's handwriting and you look at this note, it was not his handwriting. It was very, very clear. Yet that's the evidence that the general staff has. So on October 13th, 1894, with an empty file, basically, the Minister of War, whose name is General Augustin Mercier, and another member of the general staff named Major Dupat de Clam will summon Dreyfus to their office. Dreyfus doesn't know why he's being summoned, but he'll be summoned then. Now, the purpose at this point was, because they knew that they really didn't have any evidence or any proof, but they wanted to get an undisputable set of evidence, and that was to be a confession. Because in French law, and in much law in antiquity, confession was always looked at, once he confessed, it's over. So they tried to get a confession from Dreyfus, and then the idea was call him in, he wouldn't know what it was about, and then they'd be able to get the confession, and all would be done, and they could put the matter behind them, and they'd know who their spy was, and they could be done with it. There's only one problem, that on the morning of October 15th, Dreyfus he underwent a tremendous ordeal from these two majors, and he wouldn't admit anything, right? He wouldn't be now. Dreyfus is not known as being the sharpest tool in the shed. We're going to see he's going to be really a hero of history who never understands what happened to him, but he knows he's not guilty. So no matter how they try to trick him into confessing to being a spy, he never admits anything. Even at one point in the discussion, Major Dupat puts a revolver on the table and tries to suggest suicide, that he should just take his own life and put the whole thing behind him. But Dreyfus says, I'm not gonna take my life, because I need to live to establish my innocence here. And the whole thing becomes very heated, and really the military is in a very difficult predicament now, because they have a spy. They suspected someone really for no other reason than the fact that he's Jewish, but they're convinced it's him. Yet they know they have no evidence to prove that he's the spy, and the one thing they were hoping on was to get a confession out of him. They don't have. Nevertheless, they arrest him, and they accuse him of conspiring with the enemy, and they tell him he's going to be brought before a court-martial court to discuss the whole thing. Now, up until this point, the whole thing is kept quiet from the public because the general staff, the military, knew that they had a potential debacle on their hands. But on October 29th of 1894, the whole affair was leaked to the press. It was revealed in an article in La Libre Parole, again, my French is terrible, which was a terribly anti-Semitic newspaper, as many of the newspapers were in France. And this really began the press campaign that would go on until the trial. Now, at this point, there's no one defending Dreyfus, right? The press, they know there's a spy, they see it's been blamed on a Jew, and it's a no holds barred to blame it on that Jew, and every anti-Semitic canard comes out from the gutters and the sewers. And it's just an anti-Semitic bloodbath in France from this point until the trial. And it really, at this point, it undertones or overtones the anti-Semitism of the trial from this point, or from the whole affair from this point until the end. Now, what's interesting is the general staff, their issue with Dreyfus was partially that he was Jewish, and partially also that he was from Alsace, and he spoke German, and therefore they thought they partially it was because he was a German sympathizer. The press made no issue of that. It was the fact that he was a Jew that was the problem, and it was all the Jews trying to take over France. Now, on November 3rd, 1894, General Saussure, who was the military governor of Paris, reluctantly gives order for an inquiry because he sees there's no evidence. He sees what's going on. I guess he's a person of a certain amount of, he's a certain upstanding, at least at some level, but he's under tremendous public pressure at this point, and he therefore allows the court-martial to go on. Now, the trial opens next, it's going to be roughly a year later, December 19th, 1894, at 1 o'clock p.m., and it's a closed trial. Now, at the time when the decision is made to make it a closed trial, again, the anti-Semitic press goes crazy that, why do they want to make it a closed trial? Because the military is in the hands of the Jews, and this way they can acquit them without any of us seeing it. But nonetheless, they make it a closed trial. And the way the court-martial works is it was 7 officers who were both judge and jury. Now, even though the officers came into the trial convinced that Dreyfus was guilty, the lack of evidence and the firm and logical arguments of Dreyfus's attorney and Dreyfus's constant denial of any of the charges, even getting very upset at some point when it's clear that different members of the military are making things up, and they become very shaken by this. So here they thought it was an open and closed case, yet they're very shaken up by the facts that are presented in front of them. So the judges take leave to deliberate. Now, at this point, the French general staff, sensing that they might have trouble on their hands because they know if Dreyfus is acquitted, there's going to be all kinds of problems in the country, they pass on to the judge. Now, by the way, this was illegal in French law, but they pass on to the judges because usually it's supposed to be before the trial begins and both sides are supposed to get it. But they pass on a dossier which had documents in it that proved unequivocally that Dreyfus was guilty. There were communications between the German embassy and between Dreyfus and had his name in it, and this proved unequivocally that he was the spy. There's only one problem we're going to see is that the whole thing was a forgery, but that's what happens at this point. So the officers / judges are relieved, and just a few days later, after the a few days later, right, the trial begins on December 19th, and on December 22nd, just 3 days into the trial, the judges, after several hours of deliberation, they make their decision that Dreyfus is in fact guilty, and they sentence him to life in prison. But it's not just any prison. He is sentenced to go to Devil's Island, which is it's in South America, and it is a terrible place, right? There's no human there except for Dreyfus and his guards, and it's just they basically their goal was to essentially sentence him to death, and they thought by sending him to Devil's Island that would take care of it. Now, why did they sentence him to death straight out for being guilty of treason? That's because the death sentence for political crimes had been abolished in France in 1848. So on a technicality, they couldn't sentence him to death. So therefore, they thought by sending him to Devil's Island that they were essentially sentencing him to death. Now, we're going to see that the laugh will be on him. The laugh will be on them, because here they thought Dreyfus would die within a year or two from the terrible heat, the probably malaria, the yellow fever, the malnutrition. But Dreyfus will survive the whole thing and outlive many of his guards, who will die in the process of guarding him. Now, after he's found guilty, before he's sent to Devil's Island, he's marched through the streets. They make a whole scene to disgrace him. They take a sword and break it in half. They take off all his signets and medals and everything and rip it up. And the whole process of him being marched through the streets, everyone's yelling, not down with the Germans, not down with the spy, but down with the Jews. It's only anti-Semitic canards at this point, because at this thing, the whole debacle has been turned into the Jews against the French. And that is I guess the end of our first chapter of the Dreyfus affair. At this point, the oldest brother of Dreyfus, Matthew Dreyfus, takes on the campaign for trying to reveal the truth. He knows his brother's not guilty, and he just knows that the truth has to be revealed. So he starts to form a number of allies from the not the anti-Semitic press, but the more liberal press, and they all go on their investigative reporting, trying to uncover the truth of what really happened here. And slowly but surely, the details start to come out. And as they come out, now by the way, at the time of the trial already, this was a major trial of the century. It was like the O.J. Simpson trial of the century. That the correspondents come from all over the world, including one by the name of Theodore Herzl, who we'll talk about more next week. But the original case was, even though it was a closed courtroom, but the coverage of it was a world affair at this point. So in France, as they're trying to uncover, at least the Dreyfus's brother and his allies are trying to uncover what really happened, two camps established in the company. There's the Dreyfusards, who are in support of Dreyfus's innocence, and there's the anti-Dreyfusards. And we're going to see that throughout the whole process over the next few years, there's a number of anti-Semitic uprisings. Every time the Dreyfusards start to sort of get some evidence, get on the upper hand, make it look like they might be able to overturn the judgment against Dreyfus, there's pogroms and there's anti-Semitic attacks, and it's just a terrible time to be a Jew in France. Now, 2 years after Dreyfus's sentencing in 1896, evidence comes to light, primarily through the investigation of Georges Picquart, who was the head of the counter-espionage division of the French government, and he identifies the real spy. That is a French army major by the name of Ferdinand Walsin Esterhazy. What happens at this point, and he has unequivocal proof that is Esterhazy. He has documents that are intercepted from the German embassy that have Esterhazy's name on it, and is unequivocal proof that Dreyfus was not the spy. What happens now? The high-ranking military officials, the general staff, start to try and suppress the new evidence, and they try and keep the trial from coming to court, and they try and just make the whole thing go away, do whatever they can to cover it up. So, but eventually the matter is pushed and pushed and pushed, and Esterhazy is brought in front of a military court, where after a trial lasting only 2 days, he is acquitted, and we're going to see that he is able to get off. Now, just to cover some of the evidence that was being suppressed at this point, is that Picquart realizes after he gets this evidence, that he compares the original bordereau, the original note, to Esterhazy's handwriting, and it's an exact match. Like, there's no need for an expert to see that it's the same exact handwriting. So, it's like here, like the quote unquote handwriting experts had to bend over backwards to try and show how it was Dreyfus's Dreyfus's handwriting, or how it could have been Dreyfus's handwriting. And here, there's no doubt it's Esterhazy's handwriting. Now, at this point, a man by the name of Major Hubert Joseph Henry enters and starts forging all kinds of documents to protect the French general staff. And so again, the cover-up gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And after this, Esterhazy is acquitted, but I guess realizing that he's been exposed to a certain extent, he shaves off his mustache. He flees to England, and in a series of interviews, he actually makes a confession that was published in September of 1898 that he was in fact the spy. So now it's kind of interesting. We have the spy revealed. The military is covering up the evidence that he's really the spy. We even have a confession from the actual spy, who's now safe in England, by the way. And you would think, okay, now maybe now at this point there'll be some justice for Dreyfus. Not yet. First of all, what happens is Picard is actually relieved of his duty as the head of counter-espionage, and he's sent to another station in French North Africa. And now we have a very interesting development that the public pressure of the Dreyfusards is increasing. And on January 13th of 1898, a writer by the name of Emilia Zola writes a front-page article in La Aurore, one of the newspapers, which is meant to be an open letter to President Felix Faure, and the letter is known as J'accuse, which lays out the whole case against Dreyfus. So what happens at this point is the military is really trying to keep it all quiet, not letting it get out to the public, not letting him, evidence be revealed that the real spy there's evidence that's not Dreyfus, and he's admitted it in England. Now we have an article on the front page of a major French newspaper that lays the whole case against the government and the military out for everyone to read in plain sight. What happens next? Zola is arrested and is sentenced to a year in prison and a fine of 3,000 francs for having written this article. And not only that, there are trumped-up charges brought against Pinkart that shows that the evidence that he had against Esterhazy were actually forgeries that he had made, and he is arrested and put into a French military jail. Now, at this point, the whole case has finally come back to the French courts. Remember, at this point, it's only been military courts. It's brought before a French court who's actually reviewing the case of Dreyfus. Now, we have another interesting twist at this point, that on August 30th of 1898, there's more evidence coming up about Colonel Henry, who we mentioned before, who was making all kinds of forgeries to try and cover up the French general staff, and he is brought in for questioning. And after an hour of questioning, he actually breaks down and makes a full confession. He's arrested and taken to jail, and he kills himself in the first few days that he's in prison. Finally, on August 7th, 1899, so just to add everything up at this point, we have a confession from the real spy who's living safely in England. We have one of the key figures who tried to cover up for the French general staff, who has admitted his guilt and killed himself. And now we have the new trial for Dreyfus. So you would think at this point it's going to be an open and shut case, that Dreyfus will come in, he'll be acquitted, and it'll all be fine finally for Dreyfus. Now you can imagine that at this point, Dreyfus has been in Devil's Island for several years, and he's survived all of it, and he didn't know any of this is going on. It's not like he could get mail, it's not like he could get phone calls, nothing. He doesn't know any of this is going on, and all of a sudden he gets notice that he's going back to France from South America. Even though the case had been overturned, it was going to be a new trial. He was treated like a prisoner the whole way, and he comes back to France and finds out that all of this has been going on for the past number of years. So you would think it's an open and shut case, but there's one thing you're not factoring in, and that is that the honor of the French military and France in general is on the line here. Because if it's revealed that all of this it started off as a misstep and then a tremendous cover up by the French military, it will look very bad for the honor of France. So the Supreme Court the Supreme Court annuls the original sentence. They have a new trial and a new court-martial trial. And in that trial, once again, Dreyfus is found guilty. Now it's crazy. With everything's going on, he's found guilty once again. But they at least come to the conclusion, essentially, that he's guilty for the amount of time that he's already served. And so you know, that's like the French government's way of trying to save a little face over here. Now, by the way, it wasn't like the first time where he was unequivocally guilty. It was a very close vote, but nevertheless, he's found guilty. Now, the day after the verdict, Dreyfus, after a ton of hesitation, actually agrees to accept a pardon from the French president. Now, by accepting the pardon, he's also admitting his guilt, because, you know, you have to admit your guilt to accept a pardon. But at this point, he just wanted to put the whole thing behind him. He wanted to go back to his family, live a free life, and therefore, on September 19th, 1899, Dreyfus is pardoned by now President Émile Loubet. And on September 21st, 1899, he's released from prison. He's allowed to return from his family. It doesn't end there, right? Because at this point, he's still, the attitude in France is still that he is a guilty man. And there's still this public battle between the Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards. And finally, in 1906, right? So this whole thing's been going on for 20 years now. In 1906, finally, the Supreme Court of France will turn over the whole thing. Dreyfus will be fully exonerated. He'll be reinstated into the army with the rank that he should have had at that point had he stayed the whole time, which would be the rank of major, and he will participate in the First World War, and he'll die in 1935, never having known what in the world happened to him and what he went through and the forces he unleashed in nature. Now, many people looked at this and hoped that in the early 1900s, when the whole thing was over, that, okay, this was just a blip in the history of France, a little anti-Semitic uprising, it's gonna go away. But little did they realize that this was not just a isolated event. This was really the tip of the iceberg. This was the beginning of all of the unbelievably crazy events that we're going to have in the 20th century, and it's going to spawn off so much what we see in the 20th century, not the least of which we'll continue with next week, is that Viennese reporter who covered the whole case, Theodor Herzl, who eventually, in response to what he witnesses in France, will start the modern movement of political Zionism, and that's where we'll continue next week, and I look forward to discussing it with you. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next time.